So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar today. We're going to be focusing on Microsoft Teams, the new collaboration tool from Microsoft. My name is Jonathan Burkett, and I'm one of the senior technical consultants here at Ultima. My focus is very much around the Microsoft Unified Collaboration space. So traditionally, I've worked with Skype for Business and Skype for Business Online, and now I'm very much moving into working with Microsoft Teams. And before that, my background was very much around voice. So it was typically enterprise voice deployments and PBX replacement projects that I would be working on. Today I'm going to walk through the features and functionality of Teams. A couple of bits of housekeeping. We are going to be recording this session and making it available to everyone later on. Also, Teams is a Office 365 service, so this information was correct as of Friday. It will be changing in the future, so just a couple of bits of housekeeping there. So the agenda is introductions. I'm going to do a quick slide on the offerings from Microsoft, and then we're going to dive into Microsoft Teams, the various parts, features, functionality, architecture and voice services, the hardware which is available for Teams, which is expanding quite rapidly, a little bit around compliancy, eDiscovery and security, moving on to how Ultima can help you on your Teams journey, and then if we have time, question and answer session at the end. So, moving on. So Microsoft currently have 3 unified comms offerings. You have the traditional Skype for Business, and before that, Link on-premise solutions. A new version of Skype for Business came out at the back end of last year, which was Skype for Business 2019. It's a very fully featured product. It's the on-prem solution, and typically, if customers want third-party integration, so contact center being a big one, or if there are security requirements stopping them from going to the cloud, Skype for on-prem or Skype for Business on-prem is still very much the solution that we would be recommending. You also have Skype for Business Online, which is the cloud version of Skype. It's still fully supported, but Microsoft are making a strong push to move people who are on Skype for Business Online across onto Teams. The most use we see for Skype for Business Online at the moment is around hybrid mode as part of the journey from on-premise up into Microsoft Teams. And finally, we have Microsoft Teams, which is, as the slide says, the new intelligent communication platform from Microsoft. It's been around for just over 2 years now, and it's been very strongly pushed by Microsoft as the future of collaboration. Most of their development effort is being pushed into putting new features and functionality into Teams. In September 2018, Microsoft announced feature parity between Microsoft Teams and Skype for Business Online, which was one of the big blockers that was stopping people moving natively across to Teams. And then just a couple of facts about Teams. There's currently 500,000 organizations using Teams. 91% of the Fortune 100 companies are using Teams. There are about 150 organizations with more than 10,000 active users of Teams, and Teams is currently available in 181 markets, supporting 44 languages. So this isn't a small platform, it's gaining traction very quickly and growing rapidly. So that was just a little bit of kind of the offerings that are available. Moving on to what actually is Teams. Well, we've already said it's the new collaboration platform from Microsoft. It brings together features that were in Skype before, so chat, meeting and calling, and adds in Teams, which is the Slack-like collaboration space which Microsoft are introducing. It's available as both a desktop and a mobile client, and a bit later on I'll go into exactly what platforms are supported. The way I like to think about Teams is it's a single pane of glass for users to basically access all their applications and all their data for their day job. That's all a bit abstract. So to put it into a bit of context, here at Ultima, we're using Teams. We typically use it when a new project is started. So when it's working across multiple disciplines and multiple parts of the business, we can use a team to collaborate and share documents and keep everyone up to speed and up to date on the progress of the project. Also in the productivity team, which is where I sit, there's obviously a lot of new technology coming through all the time. So we use team channels to keep on top of that, to share the new products and the new features that are becoming available, and also best practice around them. And finally, we use it as a knowledge sharing tool. The team I work in, we're consultants, we're all out on the road all the time. We very rarely are in the same city, let alone the same building. So we use Teams to ask those questions that you get when you're doing design and deployment work around, have you ever seen this before? What's the best approach? Those kind of questions. So it kind of keeps us all in touch, and it replaces the old email distribution lists that we used to use. So that's kind of a little bit of an insight into how we use Teams to kind of streamline our work processes. So moving on. So what actually can you do with Teams? I tend to break it down into 4 key areas. You've got chat, which is your traditional instant messaging, peer-to-peer, and also group chats. You have meetings, so that is the scheduling of, and then actually running the meetings, so the online meetings and similar functionality to what WebEx and Webinar can provide. You have the voice services, so making and receiving outbound calls, the audio conferencing elements, what in Skype land we would call enterprise voice. And then you have Teams. This is the Slack-like collaboration space, which is the big new part and new feature that Microsoft are bringing in. As well as kind of the collaboration space, you can also attach documents in there. You can also bring in bots into those type of areas, and basically try and provide an intelligent place for people to collaborate on. So now we're just going to kind of go through. So the chat features, if you've used Skype for Business, the chat experience is very similar. You've got your peer-to-peer functionality. You can seamlessly escalate up from a instant messaging to a voice call to a video call, bring in ad hoc people as you want to, initiate desktop sharing. So it's the functionality you'd get in Skype moved across to the Teams platform. There's video blurring, which Microsoft introduced back end of last year as well, which is quite a clever technology that they've brought in. Can really break down the barriers of people wanting to use video in peer-to-peer and also team and chat sessions. So that's a nice little feature they've added in. It is worth noting, if you've used Skype in the past and had your conversation history in Outlook, Teams doesn't write to the user accessible bit of a user's mailbox. So the chat history is actually held in Teams, and it's fully accessible as kind of a history you can scroll back through and search through as you want to. So moving on. So again, meeting functionality has very much been brought across from Skype world. The features and functionalities are very similar, and as I mentioned earlier, Microsoft announced back in September 2018 that Skype and Teams are now feature comparable from a meeting point of view. It's worth noting that Microsoft are actually in the process of redesigning the meeting tab. We don't have an ETA of when that will be available, but from what we hear and understand, the tab is going to be a lot closer to what you would see in Outlook from kind of the month and week and working week views rather than kind of what you have at the moment. There is an Outlook plugin for Teams, so from an end user point of view, it's very easy to actually start scheduling Teams meetings, and you can coexist the Skype and Teams plugin together. So for coexistence and migration, you can carry on providing both services, although from a planning point of view, you need to be a bit careful about doing that to avoid user confusion. Teams does support clientless meeting join, so browser-based experience. And again, when we come to the client section in a bit, I'll go through which browsers are supported, but that is there, so people don't have to have the Teams client installed to be able to join your meetings. What's missing? At the moment, you can't do polls. That's something I know a small subset of users used as part of the Skype online meeting experience. There are third-party applications which you can use to replicate that type of functionality. Also, I would say if you're going to be doing larger meetings, it's worth exploring the Teams Live features and functionality, which is a separate product which sits alongside Teams. It's more geared towards running larger scale meetings, so it has formal Q&A functionality built into it. It has the ability to bring in extra video sources as well. So again, when you come to do your migration projects, you need to do the kind of user profiling around what type of meetings and which technology you want to use to do them, to make sure you get the right fit. Before we move on, I just want to call out coexistence for meetings. At some point during most migrations, you are going to have users on Skype and users on Teams scheduling meetings on their respective platform. You can't join a Teams meeting from a Skype client, and you can't join a Skype meeting using the Teams client. So that does mean that users are either going to need both clients installed, or make use of the web clientless, or the web browser-based clientless experience that is available. So it's just something to be, again, during the planning and design phase of the migration, just to kind of be aware of that element of it, so you can avoid user confusion. Also just announced by Microsoft, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago now, they are bringing the meeting migration service to Teams meetings. This is the service that when you move a mailbox from on-premise to online, and move a user from Skype on-premise to Skype online, basically loops through their mailbox and updates all their previously scheduled meetings and future meetings to, at the moment, click on or connect to Skype for Business Online. That service up until now hasn't updated URLs as you move a user across to Teams. It's currently in private preview to actually make that update. And as it's in private preview, it should be about 3 months before it becomes publicly available. At that point, when you move someone from Skype for Business Online to Microsoft Teams, all their meetings will be converted across to Teams meetings. So it's speeding up that process of moving people off the Skype for Business platform. So I think that's it for meetings. So actual Teams, what is it? It's basically a place where people can come to either on an ad hoc or a more permanent basis to collaborate on specific features and projects. There are 2 key bits to Microsoft Teams. You have the Teams themselves, which is basically your access control and role bit of it. It also controls the discoverability of a team when you create it. When I say discoverability, you can either create it as a public team, which people within your organization can then search for and request to join, or as a private team, and at that point users can't search for it. And if you want to add in new members, you can either do that by adding them to the Office 365 group, or giving them the 7-digit or 7-character access code to come into the meeting. At the moment, the access control around a team isn't particularly granular. So once you give someone access to the team, you're giving them access to all the channels which are associated and all the documents which are associated to that team. Microsoft are at the moment working on more granular controls, so you can actually say this team or this channel only certain people can view. We don't have an ETA around when that will be either in preview or become general availability, but it's one to keep an eye out for, and I'm sure they'll make a announcement when it becomes available. The granularity of control around Teams becomes particularly important when we start talking about guest access, which is the ability to invite people from outside of your organization to participate in a team. So again, typically Ultimately, when we're running projects, we'll have a team set up and we will invite relevant parties from that organisation to join the team. At the moment, they can see all the content. What we want to be able to do is narrow it and control it in more granular, so specific channels are available to everyone, specific only, or specific channels are only for internal use. So I've mentioned the term channel a couple of times. Channel is where the work actually happens. In its most basic form, it's a persistent threaded conversation into which you can add documents. Documents are then shared, saved to a dedicated SharePoint site, which is created automatically as part of a team creation. Channels are basically where your discussions happen, where you can collaborate together on documents. You can also add into a channel tabs, bots, and applications. And this is kind of moving into the expandability that Teams can provide. So Microsoft, one of their kind of key design features was to make Teams very expandable, so third parties could relatively easy hook in and surface their information and their applications directly through the Teams interface. It's very much an ongoing process at the moment. There's, I think, about 100 applications in there at the moment, but again, companies are constantly coming on board and providing applications. So a couple of examples of things. At the most basic, you can surface Salesforce or dynamic CRM pages, actually as deep links directly up into a channel. One we use is, there's an ADP bot, which is a payroll system. So rather than having to reach out to the payroll team, you can actually ask the bot a limited number of questions specifically relating to your information. Channels are also mail enabled. So an IT use we've seen for that is, rather than Office 365 alerts and audit messages and things like that going out to a email distribution group, instead they're being sent to a channel, which is, they're kind of permanently kept there, and you can then have threaded conversations associated with specific alerts and notifications. And again, it's all in one place. If people or in the future need to come back and review what was said or what was actioned about a particular notification, all that information is there and available as a historic record. So that's kind of the Teams element of Teams. Then voice services. So again, if you've used Skype for Business Online, a lot of the functionality is very similar. So you've got your basic in and outbound dialing features. And as with Teams, the emphasis is very much around giving control to the user, so allowing them to set their own call forwarding rules, setting up their own team pickup groups, and things along those lines. Teams also now supports call queues and auto attendants. I'll go into those in a little bit more detail in a coming up slide, but basically this is how, if you have a hunt group requirement, so the ability to bring in a call to a number and then distribute it out to a group of people, the call queues and the auto attendant are the features that you would use to kind of replicate that level of functionality, and they're now fully supported to add in Teams endpoints. And on voicemail, Microsoft have developed a new voicemail platform as a replacement for the old Exchange Unified messaging service. It's called Microsoft Cloud Voicemail. It's basically a re-engineering of the unified messaging role to take it away from Exchange, move it up into the Azure platform, so it can be accessed from a wider range of platforms and with fewer dependencies. It includes most of the old Exchange Unified messaging features. At its core, it will basically deliver a voicemail message to the user's inbox as an attachment, so they can then listen back to it when they're ready to. What I would say, the biggest feature missing from cloud voicemail at the moment is the old Outlook voice access service. Now, this was one of those features, if your organization used it, they would use it a lot and it was a requirement. It wasn't a huge number of organizations which actually used that though. So it's just something, again, to be aware of once you do it, or as you're doing your planning and your migration strategies, to review whether you're using that service and whether it's going to be a showstopper for you moving across. What I would say is for the voice features, as with Skype for Business Online, you need a Microsoft phone system license and also a calling plan to be able to fully exploit all of the features that are available. If you don't have an E5 license, you'll also need an audio conferencing add-on to enable the audio dial-in aspect that are available in meetings. So we've talked a little bit about the features and functionality which users can get from the client. I just wanted to run through at a reasonably high level the actual architecture of Teams. And this is more to give a sense of how Teams hooks into various other parts of Microsoft 365. So there's basically 5 main building blocks to it. You've got the clients themselves. So this covers the desktop client and the mobile client. There's currently clients available for Windows and for Mac, and they are on the click to run stream. So users automatically get updates. There's no requirement for IT to intervene and package up and push out updates and things like that. It all comes down seamlessly in band. There are also mobile clients available, so for Android and iOS. There was a Windows Phone app, but that was retired about a year ago, July 2018. So again, as you're doing design and planning, it's just something to be aware of. I don't think there's a huge amount of Windows Phone out there still. Finally, you've got the web clients. So currently you have support for Internet Explorer 11, Microsoft Chrome, Microsoft Edge, Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. Bit of a warning, all those clients are available. The level of functionality between the clients or between the browsers does vary a little bit. For the best experience, Microsoft are recommending Edge RS2 or above. But again, what I would say on that point is part of piloting and testing, work through the different browsers, make sure the IT team are comfortable with what the experience should be in each different browser, so then they can advise users if they log service desk requests and things along those lines. After the team clients, you have the Microsoft Core services. So these are existing Microsoft 365 services that teams leverage to provide functionality. The main ones here are Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive for Business. So when you upload a file to Teams, the team client is actually pushing that file into either SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business. And where the actual file lands depends on how it was shared. I've got a slide in a bit which talks about where information in Teams actually rests, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference or the different use cases as to when SharePoint versus OneDrive is used on that slide. Similarly, when you send an email to a channel, that's all being handled by Exchange Online from kind of a routing and delivery point of view and a hosting of the mailbox point of view. Exchange Online is also used as a repository for compliancy information for certain bits that or certain types of information that can be transacted in the Teams client. And again, I've got a data where your data lives slide later on. You've got Azure AD. This is the identity management piece for Teams. It's also where the Office 365 groups live, and the Office 365 groups provide the access controls around who can join a team and what roles they enjoy once they join that team. Also, Azure AD provides the guest access identities. So when you invite someone outside of your organization into a team, a guest account is created in Azure AD for that particular user to use when they log into your team's environment. You then have the intelligent communication cloud. This is basically the voice engine. So when you come to do in and outbound dialing, when you're talking about call queues and auto attendants, when you talk about audio conferencing, all those elements sit within the intelligent cloud blob which Microsoft have developed. And these are actually common services which Skype for Business Online also leverage. So they've got a pretty good track record around providing voice services using that intelligent communication hub. And finally, you have the actual new team services, which were specifically created for this product. And this is basically what's providing the teams and the channels and the activity feed functionality to the Skype, to the Teams clients and to the Teams users. So I think the main takeaway from this slide is that Teams has built and leverages lots of existing Microsoft 365 services, and it's been architected in such a way that as Microsoft introduce more services to Microsoft 365, the Teams client will be able to hook into and leverage those new services very easily. We've already seen that happening a little bit with the Microsoft Graph APIs that Microsoft are pushing out at a pretty fast rate at the moment. And I guess the other note about the architecture is it scales a lot better than the old Skype for Business architecture did. In Skype world, you were very much restricted to the pool model, which Microsoft have developed. The Teams architecture is entirely different to that. It doesn't have the concept of pools, which means it's going to scale up a lot quicker and a lot better than the old Skype architecture did. So that, again, that's a very high level of what the inside of Teams looks like. Teams is basically a black box service from Microsoft, so they don't go into the very detailed nitty gritty of what's under the hood in most of these cases. So that's a high level technical architecture. So next, the logical architecture. So how an actual user interfaces with the various bits and elements. So for example, when a user accesses a team or tries to access a team, and then the channels within the team, you have the modern group or the Office 365 group acting as the gatekeeper and access control monitor there. So controlling whether a user can see the content, and if they can see the content, what type of roles they can have. So whether they are an owner or just a viewer and those kind of things. Similarly, if a user interacts with someone via chat, so this is a peer-to-peer chat rather than a chat in a channel, the chat services will kick in and then reach out and leverage the voice elements and the meeting elements if that chat is then escalated up to a voice or a video chat. And you've got basically the tabs and the apps, which again are the extendable bits. So the ability to bring in third-party applications and data directly into either a chat or into a channel, meaning that a user can access all the information they need for their day-to-day job and role directly from the Teams client and don't have to open up another client or go out to another web browser. And then you have all the content or the chat content being archived back into the messaging stack, which will eventually push it into Exchange Online. So again, from a compliancy and any discovery point of view, you can go in and search for those chat conversations if need be at a later date. So again, logical architecture of how the user will interact with the various Teams services. So for voice services, we mentioned a few slides ago now that from a user point of view, you can use Teams as a telephone replacement service. So have your in and outbound dialing. There are a couple of licensing requirements and a couple of ways to actually achieve in and outbound calling. So from a licensing point of view, basic thing you'll need is Microsoft Phone System license. That's included with E5, available as an add-on for E3 licenses. So again, when you come to look at your design around a Teams migration, it's just, you need to just kind of make sure you've ticked that box that you've got the right licensing. Aside from licensing, there's a couple of ways to actually technically deliver calls into Teams. You have calling plans and you have direct routing. So calling plans is a more native Microsoft experience, whereas direct routing allows you to leverage existing or your existing PBX estate or existing SIP trunks to bring in calls. And then I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of the two options. So calling plans. This is the simplest way of achieving voice services using Teams. It's entirely provided by Microsoft. There's no requirement for any on-premise integration. All you need to do is buy the licensing and apply it, and then allocate the numbers out to the users. For simple telephony requirements, and if you just want to have a play and see what the system's like and how it works, calling plans are a great route to go down. There is the caveat that calling plans are only available in the 11 countries on the screen at the moment. Microsoft are working constantly to expand that list. It's not a particularly quick or easy process though. But if you do have any countries that aren't on the list at the moment, you can speak to us. We can try and get a steer from Microsoft as to if they're coming in the near future or not. So once you've identified that the countries that you're operating or the countries that your users are in are on the calling plan list, next decision is what type of calls do those users need to make. It breaks down from a Microsoft point of view anyway, as they're either domestic calling or they're domestic and international. Again, it's part of the user profiling. You need to identify which users sit in which of those buckets, and then allocate licenses as appropriate. There are currently 3 calling plans available in the UK. There's the domestic 120 minutes, domestic 1,200 minutes, and domestic 1,200 with 600 international minutes bundled in. What you'll, again, as part of the project and the migration process or piloting, we tend to start with the lower licenses and then we can upgrade them as necessary. There is another feature which I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides, communication credits, which can help with providing international calls and making sure people aren't or are stopped from making calls because they've run out of minutes. We'll come to that in a second. Microsoft also supports number porting. So if you have, or once you've done your pilot or your testing and you're happy and you move across to actually migrating users, you can move port telephone ranges across in the same way you can between telco providers in the UK. So there's an Ofcom regulated process for doing this and a process to follow if and when there are issues with the porting. So again, all the normal rules and challenges apply with porting numbers to Microsoft, as at this point they are basically just another telco. I guess quickly, when you are provisioning numbers, Microsoft has 2 types of numbers. They have user numbers, which are, as the name suggests, the numbers that you apply to your actual user accounts. They also have something called service numbers. This particularly comes into play when you are creating call queues and auto attendants. And basically, before you can assign a number to a call queue or auto attendant, it has to be converted to a service number. It's a really quick process. You basically just raise a help ticket with Microsoft, and they will convert it across in about 24 hours. Alternatively, when you actually request new numbers through the Microsoft portal, you can specify at that point whether it's a user or a service number. So if you know you're specifically going to need to create 10 call queues on new numbers, you can request 10 new numbers specifically as service numbers. Yeah, and when you do porting, you can also specify whether a number is a user, which is the default, or comes across as a service number. So again, it's just as part of the planning process. When you're reviewing your numbers, you just need to be a bit careful that you select the right type of number for when it's moved across. So that's calling plans. They are, as I said, nice, quick and easy way, if you're in a country that they're available in, to get up and running on Teams for voice services, or run a pilot to make sure that the performance and voice quality are where you need it to be. So that's calling plans. Next option is direct routing. This is the more fully featured, and I guess from my point of view, interesting way of getting voice into Teams. Basically, if you have an existing PBX estate which you want to keep, you can use direct routing to, in effect, hook up Microsoft Teams to that existing PBX estate. So this used to be, before it was generally released, called Bring Your Own SIP Trunking, which I think gives you an idea of what they're trying to achieve. And as I said, it basically allows you to connect your existing phone system to Microsoft Teams. You do need to use a certified session border controller to do this, but there's 5 or 6 of those which are now certified. So the certified session border controller providers are Audio Codes, Ribbon as they are now, and a couple of other players are working to get their border controllers certified. So it's basically just a box which sits in your environment and acts as a call routing point. So if you did have, as this kind of diagram suggests, have a direct routing set up, a call would come in via your normal or your existing PSTN connection. So that would typically be an ISDN circuit or a SIP trunk. The call will reach the session border controller, and then the session border controller will make a routing decision. It will either go, this user or this number is a legacy on-premise PBX number, and send the call down to your telephone system. Alternatively, it will go, actually this user is or has been migrated across to Teams, and send that call up into the Microsoft 365 cloud. That call will then go through the routing services in Microsoft and be presented to the user's Teams clients. What you can also do is you can fork the call on the session border controller. So if a user for some reason wanted to use their handset and use the team client, you can actually tell the session border controller to send the call to both places, and then whoever picks up first is where the call would be delivered to and taken to. Again, it's a useful feature in certain scenarios. It can be useful during coexistence. So again, it's another feature that we can kind of leverage to cater to most use cases for users. The good news is, if you have an existing session border controller, an existing certified session border controller that is, Teams compatibly should just be a firmware upgrade, which you'll be able to download via your support portal from whoever your vendor is. If you don't have a session border controller on site, or want, as part of this project, to decommission session border controllers to kind of reduce the complexity of the estate, there are a couple of options. Sonos, Ribbon and Audio Codes are now provide virtual session border controllers hosted in Azure. So that's one route to go down to. So basically you would take that on-prem bit of tin or the session border controller and push it up into the Azure cloud. And that's a supported approach from both the SBC providers and from Microsoft. The alternative is to speak to a partnered hoster. So this is typically one of your large telcos. So in the UK, you'd be talking about BT, Tata Business Services or Orange Business Services are currently certified ones. And what they can basically do is give you a SIP trunk going directly from their cloud into the Microsoft 365 cloud. And then your call would come in, or your DDI ranges would come in, hit BT's cloud, for example, and get directly routed into Microsoft 365. So bypassing on-prem at all completely. So again, with direct routing there, it gives us a lot of options and tools to use to try and address and solve particular requirements and routing options. So yeah, if you can't just do calling plans, direct routing gives us a lot more options to work with to provide functionality. You can mix direct routing and calling plans. So if you have some users in the UK, we can give them calling plans. If you have some users down, I don't know, South Africa, for example, we can use direct routing in one of its flavors to provide functionality directly through Microsoft. So they're the two main methods, well, the two methods of bringing voice into Microsoft Teams. There is also an option around communication credits. Now, this is a add-on license which complements calling plans. So when I spoke about calling plans, I mentioned that there are two predominant types. You've got domestic and international. If you have a user who only makes international calls once every 3 months, it isn't really viable to either give them a domestic plan and then upgrade their plan for the one-off times they need to make international calls. So what you can do is you can use communication credits, which is basically a pool of money which you've preloaded onto your Microsoft account, and that allows users to draw on that pool to make international calls as one of the uses from it. As you can see from the slide, there's a couple of other things that it's used for as well. But most of the time I use it to kind of optimize the licensing experience for domestic users while allowing them to dial out internationally once every 3 months or so. Communication credits also mean if you run out of calling plan minutes, rather than the service just stopping working, this is for outbound calls, rather than users just being given a message saying, sorry, you can't make outbound calls, you'll actually start to draw on the communication credit pool to fund those outbound calls. So it's a handy way of preventing interruption to service. And with communication credits, there's a couple of methods around recharging that pool of money. Depending on how quickly you kind of are using it up, you can either have a minimum level. So if it drops below £50, recharge the account with another £50, or you can just set it up as a monthly recharge. First of every month, put another £50 onto it. Generally, the auto recharge with a minimum limit is the best approach, because minutes do actually expire after 12 months. So you don't want to have too much money in effect just sitting in that pool. But again, when you're going through design and planning, there are certain use cases that communication credits can help you address and solve to kind of allow the project to continue. So that's communication credits. So very early on, I mentioned call queues and auto attendants. So this is the slide where I dive into a bit more detail. So yeah, call queues and auto attendants, basically they are your hunt group replacements in Microsoft Teams. So you will either allocate a call queue a number, and a group of agents, and then when calls come into that specific number, the call will be distributed out to those users. At the moment, you have two distribution methods. If you're familiar with Skype on-prem, there's a lot more options available there. At the moment, Microsoft are just sticking with two, just to make sure they're all behaving themselves as they should be before adding in more complicated options. The attendant is probably the most useful of the two. That basically will ring the user or users regardless of their present status. So a problem we had with Skype for Business on-prem common area phones or hot desk phones is after 15 minutes they go into an away state and they suddenly stop getting response group call queue calls. The attendant mode actually allows you to override that, and regardless of what status the device is in, it will still attempt to present the call to it. Agent opt-out is also supported on call queues. Again, that's one of those niche features. If you use it, you'll be very attached to it and you'll be glad it's included. If you don't use it, you won't particularly care about it, but it's there if you come across scenarios that basically need the ability for an agent themselves to say, at this time I'm included as part of a group, at other times I'm not. So call queues are the basic way of doing it. If you've got more complicated call routing scenarios, so the typical one is the IVR menus, you dial a main number, you get a welcome message, and then you are played a list of options, so press 1 for sales, 2 for support, etc. That's when your auto attendants come in. So they have the DTMF menus associated with them, along with call actions. They can also be configured with open and closed hours. So between 8 and 5:30, it presents the calls to a call queue. Outside of those hours, it plays a message and sends the call to voicemail. Is a very typical configuration. You can also set up holiday times, so Easter, Christmas, May Day bank holidays, that kind of thing. So you can basically set them up once at the beginning of the year, and then hopefully you'll avoid those phone calls on Friday late afternoon before a bank holiday going, can you put the phone system or can you sort the phone system out for us for Monday, please? So again, auto attendants, you can do a lot with them. I would say make sure you design them out properly, otherwise you can tie yourselves in quite a few knots trying to get them to do exactly what you want. So designing and testing of auto attendants, make sure it's on your planning list. And again, with the call queues and attendants, Microsoft are, now they've got the baseline features in place, they're looking to expand out what you can do with them, and the options and the customization available. So I'd imagine over the next 3 to 6 months, new features are going to be added to both of these elements. Hardware. So in Teams, most people are going to be on soft clients. They are still going to need some form of headset. Microsoft have a certification program for headsets and speakerphones and things like that. There's a portal which you can kind of go to and walk through the various use cases and spaces that you're trying to fill to find appropriate devices. The list of at least personal devices is just going to keep on growing as more companies go through the certification program and get that kind of stamp of approval. So personal devices, USB headsets and Bluetooth headsets are the two primary ones there. Also starting to come out now are standalone phones. So these are standalone IP phones running a version of the Teams client. So the first to market, I think, with the audio codes and the Yealink devices. They are Android based. So they are basically running a version of the Teams Android client on them. So they were pretty quick to come out to market. These are the kind of devices that you'll be giving to your execs and those kind of level of people. They won't necessarily be the devices you're putting out on unmanned receptions and things like that. Poly, as they are now, are also working on a range of phones, the CCX range, which will be Teams compatible. Those devices are starting to come out, at least in preview at the moment, so another 3 months and we should be well on the way with those. Those devices, I think, are going to scale down to the common area type scenarios. So when I say common area, that's things like the mail room and unmanned receptions and those kind of areas where you want a phone, so people can basically pick up and dial without needing a client or a PC. You can also use the common area phones in meeting or in smaller meeting rooms. So if it's only a 2 or 3 or 4 person meeting room, rather than needing to buy an expensive spider phone, you can use one of the cheaper devices. So, and again, this comes back to during the design and planning, profiling both your users to see what devices they want and need, and your spaces, so meeting rooms and common area spaces and hot desking areas, to see what the requirements around those are. And the team's story around those kind of devices is getting a lot stronger. And it's only going to get better this year. At the other end of the scale, you have got the Microsoft Teams meeting room system, which is a rebrand of the old Skype meeting room system, fully compatible with Teams. So that's when you are looking at your boardrooms and your 10-person meeting rooms with screens and smart boards and things like that. There's a suite of products and devices and packages available from Microsoft partners, fully certified by Microsoft, to kind of fulfill that space. I would just call out the Surface Hub 2 S's, which are due to come to the UK, I want to say end of next month, so imminently. They are going to be Teams compatible. I haven't had one to play with yet, but I'm hoping to get one in the next couple of weeks. But from the information and the webinars and whatnot that I've sat on or listened in on, they're looking to be very clever and interesting devices which can add a lot of functionality and usability to a meeting. So that's one to keep an eye on for, or keep an eye out for, if you're interested in smart devices for meeting rooms. So that was just kind of a quick overview of the hardware that's available. As I said, this list is just, or this slide is just pulling out some of what's available. There is actually a very large range of products available. Before we move on, just a point about the Polycom VVX range of devices. They do log into Teams, but you get a limited user experience. So you can make and receive calls, which is all some people need, but you don't get any of the calendar integration or one-click meeting join type functionality. So again, as part of the project, it's worth, or as part of your design and planning and exploration, it's worth having a look at those devices to see if there are any specific use cases which they address. Right, so I said a while ago I was going to talk about where data is actually stored, in Teams. So the answer is it depends on what type of data it is. Broadly, it will either end up in an individual Exchange Online mailbox, or it'll end up in SharePoint. They're the two kind of primary repositories that it stores data to. On the mailbox side, it's worth noting the information is written to an area of the mailbox which users don't have access to. So it's written to the purge section of the mailbox. So it is there, but users can't access it in the same way they could a conversation history. No, you're not going to do that, Lenovo. Sorry, yes, so the user can't actually access that content, but it is there from a retention and compliancy and eDiscovery point of view. And again, as part of your project, I would suggest engaging as early as possible with security and compliance teams, so they are aware of what is being planned and they can communicate any specific legal and compliancy requirements around data residency. Teams is now a UK hosted service, so depending on when your tenant was created, if it's reasonably recently, it should all be resident in the UK. But as I said, strongly recommend having an early conversation with your compliance and security team as part of the project. So that was where data is stored. These are some of the features that are either available in Teams at the moment or are in development, so hopefully coming soon, to help with or help answer those eDiscovery compliance and security questions around Teams. A lot of it is extending out existing Exchange and SharePoint functionality to include Teams and team content. So for example, the ATP Safe Link and Safe Attachments, they were an Exchange feature. They're now being brought across into Teams. Safe Attachment is available now. The Safe Link is in development, and as the slide said, it should be coming Q2 this year. DLP is rolling out at the moment. When I was talking to some of the guys at Microsoft, they said there is a little bit of a delay around the DLP pullback, which they are not 100% happy with at the moment. So sorry, that's basically the time frame between a document appearing in a Teams channel and the back-end scanning saying, no, this isn't meant to be shared, and pulling it back. The delay on that isn't where they want it to be, so they're working to reduce that window at the moment. Again, from a Teams and Microsoft service, so a lot of what you can do in the security compliance and the protection center, you can also do to Teams data. So that's specifically around the running a bit long, around the auditing and reporting. So this is the alerting, which you can, if you want, you can create alerts. So when a new team is created, or when content is added to that team, or when members are added, an audit log is created and an email is sent to the relevant parties. So it's the standard compliant or auditing and reporting activities and functionality that you would see around other Microsoft 365 services. Retention policy and content search is another big one, which they were pushing at the beginning of the year. So in the same way you can retain SharePoint and Exchange data, you can now apply similar policies with a similar level of granularity to Teams data, which again, it was a big one, or it was a big stopper for some companies that we were working with to migrate across. And similarly, once you've retained the data, the ability to perform eDiscovery via content search, it's the standard Microsoft 365 search panel, and all you're basically doing is either including or excluding Teams chat and Teams channel data from those search scopes. So again, if you're familiar with the eDiscovery features of Microsoft 365, Teams is now available as a search area in that. The last feature around ethical firewalling is still in development. Again, it's some verticals and some companies have it as a hard requirement, and it's been stopping projects moving forward. So ethical firewalling is in effect subdividing up your tenant to control which groups of users can communicate, I'll try that again, can communicate with which other groups of users. There's certain banking and investment requirements around that. So yeah, that's coming soon. The naming policy, banned word, and team creation are actually features of Azure AD. So in Azure AD, you can configure various controls around Office 365 group creation. So some service desks were worried about the sprawl that teams could potentially create in Azure AD. By limiting who can create groups, you can help control and stop some of that spread. And similarly, you want to control how teams are named and what they're named, so nothing inappropriate can kind of get through and be seen within the organization. Again, there are a lot of features here, so it depends on your specific requirements, which ones to enable and which ones to use. So again, it's a good discussion point as part of a discovery workshop or a planning session. So that's kind of just a flavor of what's available from a security point of view inside Teams. Licensing. So I think we've covered most of this already as various other slides, but just as a summary, basically, if you want to switch on calling, well, if you want Teams, any of the licenses in the first table will give you Teams. So it's a pretty broadly rolled out service. There is also a free version which Microsoft have available, and you can get demos and trial tenants to have a play with this if you don't have it already. The second table is very much focused around switching on the voice side of Microsoft Teams. So it was the calling plans that we've talked about and the communication credits. They've also just released the meeting room license. So this is if you have a meeting room system, whether it's a smartboard or one of the meeting room systems. Previously, you had to use full fat licenses, so a proper E3 or E5 license. The room license is a cheaper way to license those devices while retaining the functionality. So it's a good cost saving to be made there. Audio conferencing, I think we touched on briefly. It's included with E5. If you don't have an E5, there's an add-on you can buy, and that basically puts in meetings, it puts the dial-in number and the conference ID, so people who don't have or who are dialing in from a phone can still connect to those meetings. Again, as part of user profiling and persona definition, you can go through and decide which users need which sets of functionality to get the best licensing distribution across your estate. And finally, so we've talked about what Microsoft Teams is and all the features and functionality built into it. How can Ultima help with this? So at the very highest level, we're a Microsoft Fast Track partner, which means if you are reasonably happy doing the work yourself, we can engage with you as your Fast Track partner, and we can basically walk you through the migration process, work with you around checklists and task lists and project plans and things like that. The key thing with Fast Track is you do the work. We just provide guidance and support around it. If you want a more hands-on approach, we can kind of work through the whole project lifecycle with you through from, as I said, persona mapping and user profiling to reviewing your meeting rooms, reviewing the network as well to make sure that it's going to be okay to handle the extra voice traffic we're going to be adding to it, working with you around the best approach for governance and compliancy, and then the telephony integration side of things. So whether calling plans are appropriate for you, whether direct routing is the way to go, provide advice around which session border controllers are most appropriate. So the complete end-to-end migration support